NBC executives spent 40 years trying to scrub this footage from their archives, terrified that the world would see the king of late night lose control. But tonight, we reveal the one joke that forced Johnny Carson to stop his show and surrender to a 2-minute silence that changed television history. The evening had started like any other. The brassy swell of the NBC orchestra filled the air, and the audience was a sea of smiling faces, all eager to forget their troubles for 60 minutes of late-night magic. Johnny had just stepped through the rainbow curtains, his trademark grin in place, his suit sharp enough to cut glass. He went into his monologue, the timing as perfect as a Swiss watch, tossing out the playful barbs and the clever asides that had made him a household fixture for over 20 years. Ed McMahon was in his usual spot, his booming laughter echoing through the rafters. Everything was going exactly according to the script that had been written 1,000 times before. But then, Johnny's eyes drifted. Usually, he saw couples holding hands or groups of friends laughing. This time, his gaze locked onto a man who didn't fit the scene. He was tucked away in a seat just off the center aisle, wearing a tuxedo that had clearly seen better decades. The fabric was thin at the elbows, the lapels were a style that hadn't been popular since the days of the Great Depression, and he clutched a yellowed, crumbling envelope against his chest like it was the most precious treasure on earth. Johnny caught the faint, unmistakable scent of stale peppermint and mothballs drifting from the front rows, a sensory ghost that pulled him toward the stranger. While the rest of the audience roared at a joke about the local weather, this man remained perfectly still. His face was a roadmap of a long, difficult journey, etched with deep lines that spoke of 1,000 nights spent under dim spotlights in drafty theaters. There was a dignity in his posture that demanded attention, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate outward, cutting through the artificial gloss of the television studio. Johnny felt a lump form in his throat, a sensation he hadn't experienced on camera in a very long time. He found himself stumbling over a punchline, his mind racing backward through the corridors of his own memory, searching for a face he hadn't thought about since he was a young boy in Nebraska with a deck of cards and a dream. The producer in the wings noticed the hesitation and signaled for a camera change, but Johnny didn't look away. He saw the man's hands trembling slightly as he held that envelope, and he realized this wasn't just a fan who had managed to get a ticket. This was a man who had come for a specific purpose, a man who carried a weight that was finally ready to be shared. Johnny felt the professional mask begin to slip, realizing that the planned guest list no longer mattered. In that hushed moment, the king of late night knew that the man in the moth-eaten tuxedo held the key to a door Johnny had closed a lifetime ago, a secret that would force him to choose between the network's rules and his own soul. If you want to see more of these hidden Hollywood moments that the networks tried to hide, hit that subscribe button now so you never miss a secret. The silence that followed Johnny's missed punchline felt like a heavy velvet curtain falling over the room, as if the oxygen itself had been pulled out of the studio. To the audience, it was a momentary glitch, but to Johnny, the world had slowed down until the only thing left was the rhythmic thumping of his own heart and the piercing gaze of the man in the third row. Those eyes were a deep, familiar blue, framed by silver brows that held a lifetime of stories, and they were staring at Johnny with a look of profound pride that reached back across 40 years of history. Johnny stepped toward the edge of the stage, his movements deliberate as the rhythmic clicking of the man's heavy, old-fashioned wingtip shoes echoed in the sudden hush. Johnny ignored the frantic waving of the stage manager in the shadows, who was pointing at his watch and gesturing toward the "wrap it up" sign. He looked directly at the elderly man, whose hands were still white-knuckled around that brittle, yellow envelope. In an instant, the smell of grease paint and old sawdust filled Johnny's senses, transporting him back to a dusty basement in Norfolk, Nebraska. He was 12 years old again, struggling to master a simple card trick, and there was a man with a gentle voice and magic in his fingers who had told him that he had the spark of greatness. That man was Arthur Penhaligon, known to the fading vaudeville circuits as Artie the Astounding, the performer who had given a lonely boy his very first magic kit and a reason to believe. It was a connection that predated fame, wealth, and millions of nightly viewers. Artie had been a mentor when Johnny was just a kid with big ears and a dream, a man who had taught him that the real secret to a performance wasn't the trick itself, but the way you made the audience feel. Seeing him now, sitting in a suit that was literally falling apart at the seams, Johnny felt a wave of guilt wash over him for all the years that had slipped by. The industry was a cruel mistress, that often depleted the spirit of old legends, leaving them to fade into the background while the world chased the next new thing. But Artie hadn't come to beg or to remind Johnny of a debt. He had come to witness what that young boy from Nebraska had become. The producer, Fred de Cordova, stepped onto the side of the stage, his face a mask of confusion and growing anger at the delay, but Johnny raised a single hand to stop him. He didn't need a script for this, and he didn't need a guest list. He realized that the man in the third row was the reason he was standing on that stage at all, a living link to a past that felt more real in this moment than the bright lights of Hollywood. Johnny's voice, usually so steady and controlled, wavered as he finally spoke into the microphone, not to the millions at home, but to the one man who mattered. He was risking the flow of the entire broadcast, but the silence of the room told him he wasn't alone in this feeling. The audience watched in stunned confusion as the king of television knelt at the edge of the platform, reaching out toward the stranger. He whispered a name that hadn't been spoken in that studio in its entire history, a name that carried the weight of 1,000 forgotten memories. Everything changed when the man in the third row slowly stood up, his legs shaking with age, and held out the envelope as if it were a sacred offering. Johnny knew right then that the show was no longer his to control, and the mystery of what lay inside that paper was about to bring the entire country to its knees. Artie reached into the breast pocket of that weathered tuxedo and pulled out a single, crumpled index card, its edges softened by years of being handled in the dark. He didn't look at the cameras or the famous band leader in the corner. He kept his eyes fixed on Johnny, as if they were the only two souls left in the entire world. The old man's voice trembled with the weight of 4 decades as he began to explain that this card held a secret, a single piece of writing he had started the very night he watched a younger Johnny walk onto a local stage and realize his potential. "I have spent 40 years writing this for you, Johnny," Artie whispered, his voice cracking like aged parchment. He spoke of the long, lonely nights in boarding houses across the Midwest, of the years when the applause grew quieter and the bookings began to dry up until there was nothing left but the memories of what used to be. While the rest of the world saw Artie as a man whose time had passed, Artie saw himself as a guardian of a flame, watching from afar as the boy he once mentored became the brightest star in the sky. He had followed every show, every triumph, and every heartbreak, sitting in the flickering blue light of a small television set in a one-room apartment, always holding this index card, trying to capture the essence of a life spent in the service of a smile. He told Johnny about the woman he had loved, a dancer named Clara who had shared the stage with him when they were both young and full of fire. She had been the one to tell him that his true legacy wouldn't be found in the tricks he performed, but in the people he inspired to carry on after he was no longer among the living. When she passed away 20 years ago, Artie almost gave up, but then he saw Johnny on the screen, making a grieving nation laugh after a difficult day, and he realized the work wasn't finished. He had to stay. He had to keep writing, because he had promised Clara that he would deliver this final piece of himself to the only person who would truly understand its cost. The audience sat in a state of collective awe. There was something profoundly moving about the sight of this fragile man, who clearly had very little left in terms of worldly possessions, offering up a lifetime of thought as his final act. Johnny sat perfectly still, his chin resting in his hand, his eyes never leaving Artie's face. He could see the struggle in Artie's breathing, the way the old man had to pause to gather his strength, as if the very act of sitting in that chair was draining the last of his battery. This wasn't a performance for ratings. It was a man approaching the end of his path and choosing to spend his final strength on a gesture of pure, unadulterated love. Artie looked down at the index card, his thumb stroking the ink as if he were saying goodbye to an old friend. He told Johnny that he didn't want fame and he didn't want money. He just wanted to know if the boy from Nebraska still remembered the most important lesson of all. With a shaking hand, he began to unfold the card, and the air in the studio grew so thick with emotion that it felt as though the walls were closing in to listen. The studio lights seemed to dim of their own accord, narrowing the universe down to the polished surface of the mahogany desk and the two men seated there. The usual hum of the cameras and the rustle of the crew vanished, replaced by a profound, heavy anticipation that made every heartbeat feel like a drum in the chest. Artie cleared his throat, a sound as thin and brittle as dry grass, and prepared to deliver the words he had spent a literal lifetime perfecting. For years, the The world had known Johnny Carson for his quick-fire delivery and his ability to turn any situation into a punchline. But as Artie began to speak, the host's face underwent a startling transformation. The audience had come expecting a joke, but Artie's setup was not built on humor. Instead, it was a tapestry of lived experience, a poetic journey through the highs and lows of human existence. He spoke of the dusty roads of the 1930s, of the way the sun looked hitting the wheat fields of the heartland, and the feeling of standing before an audience of 5 people in a rain-slicked tent with the same passion as if they were 5,000. He was painting a picture of a life that was nearing its final horizon, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that was almost blinding. Johnny leaned in, his elbows resting on the desk, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the monitors. He saw Artie's struggle, the way the old man's chest labored under the weight of the story, yet Artie's voice gained a strange, newfound strength as he described the beauty of a missed opportunity. He talked about the roles he didn't get, the fame that eluded him, and the way he had once felt like a failure until he realized that his purpose was to be the bridge for someone else. He looked directly at Johnny, acknowledging the greatness the younger man had achieved, and explained that every success Johnny had enjoyed was a victory for the old man in the one-room apartment. It was a confession of a soul that had found peace in the shadows. The setup was a masterpiece of emotional architecture, building a foundation of shared humanity that transcended the television screen. Artie spoke of the love he held for a world that often forgot its elderly, and the way a simple smile could be the only thing keeping a person from falling into the abyss of loneliness. He was no longer just an old man in a frayed tuxedo. He was a philosopher, a poet, and a father figure all rolled into one. The audience was no longer laughing. Many were leaning forward, some with their hands over their mouths, realizing that they were being invited into a moment of sacred honesty. Johnny's hand reached out, instinctively wanting to steady Artie, but he stopped himself, honoring the old man's need to finish this final performance on his own terms. As Artie reached the conclusion of his narrative, his breathing slowed, and a calm, serene expression settled over his features. He looked at the index card one last time, then folded it back into his pocket, signaling that the preparatory work was done and the heart of the matter was finally at hand. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the realization that the punchline was coming, but it was a punchline that would change the very definition of what it meant to laugh or to cry. The moment of truth arrived with the quiet intensity of a falling star, as Artie leaned across the desk until his face was only inches from the man he had mentored so many years ago. The world outside the studio walls, with its traffic and its noise, seemed to vanish entirely, leaving only a vulnerable old man and the king of late nights suspended in a bubble of shared history. Artie took a shallow, shaky breath, and with a voice that sounded like a whisper from the heavens, he delivered the 7 words he had spent 40 years carving out of his own heart. The punchline was not a play on words, nor was it a clever observation designed to elicit a quick roar from the crowd. It was a profound, devastatingly simple truth about the beauty of being remembered, a sentence so heavy with love, and the conclusion of his story, that it felt as if the air itself had turned to stone. When the final word left his lips, the laughter that usually greeted every segment of The Tonight Show didn't just fail to arrive. It was replaced by a silence so absolute, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the room. This wasn't the silence of boredom, but the breathless quiet of a cathedral during a prayer, a moment where 20 million people collectively realized that they were no longer watching a comedy program. Johnny Carson, a man who had made a career out of having the perfect comeback for every situation, sat frozen in place, his legendary composure finally and completely shattered. He didn't reach for his water glass, he didn't adjust his tie, and he didn't look toward the band for a musical cue to save him. Instead, he slowly lowered his head into his trembling hands, his shoulders beginning to heave with a silent, visceral sorrow. The camera operators stood behind their lenses, with tears streaming down their faces, unable to move or look away. Even Ed McMahon sat in a state of stunned paralysis, his eyes fixed on the floor, his face pale as he wiped away a stray tear with the back of his hand, his usual jovial glass of water sitting untouched and forgotten on the desk. Does a moment of pure silence like this still have a place in our noisy world today? Share your thoughts in the comments about a time a celebrity showed their true human side. The seconds began to tick away on the studio clock, but nobody cared about the schedule anymore. The silence stretched out, growing deeper and more meaningful with every passing heartbeat. as the audience members in the seats began to realize that they weren't just witnesses to a joke, they were witnesses to the closing of a circle. Artie sat back in Johnny's chair, a small, peaceful smile playing on his lips, looking like a man who had finally laid down a burden he had been carrying through a long and lonely desert. He had come to tell one last joke, and in doing so, he had managed to do something no one else in the history of television had ever achieved. The king of late night remained bowed at his desk, his tears staining the polished wood, as the entire nation sat in a state of suspended animation, unified by a single, heart-wrenching moment of humanity. It was the loudest silence in the history of broadcasting, a 2-minute eternity that changed everything anyone thought they knew about Johnny Carson. In the high-stakes world of network television, where every second is worth $10,000 and a 5-second gap is considered a catastrophe, time suddenly stopped moving altogether. The on-air light continued its steady, crimson glow, pulsing like a nervous heartbeat in the rafters. But the man behind the desk made no move to bridge the divide. For 2 full minutes, the only sound in Studio One was the faint, rhythmic ticking of a stagehand's watch and the soft, muffled sniffles of 300 people who had forgotten they were an audience and remembered they were human beings. Johnny Carson remained with his forehead resting against the backs of his interlaced fingers, his eyes squeezed shut as he allowed the wave of Artie's words to wash over him. Those 2 minutes felt like a lifetime, a vast expanse of shared grief and recognition that stretched from the coast of California all the way back to the cornfields of his youth. The cameras stayed perfectly still, framing the silver-haired host and the frail old man as if they were figures in a classic oil painting. There were no commercial breaks to interrupt the spell, no frantic music from Doc Severinsen to fill the void, and no witty banter to ease the tension. It was the rawest, most honest moment in the history of the medium. As the seconds turned into minutes, the silence began to take on a quality of its own. It was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence of spirit. In living rooms across America, couples who had been married for 50 years reached out to find each other's hands, and solitary viewers stared at their screens with a lump in their throats, recognizing the truth in Artie's smile. The silence was a tribute to every person who had ever felt invisible, every worker who had done their job without thanks, and every mentor who had poured their soul into a student. Johnny was finally allowing himself to feel the weight of the crown he wore, realizing that the throne of late night was built on the shoulders of giants like the man sitting in his chair. Deep in the control booth, the director sat with his hands hovering over the switchboard. Every professional instinct told him to cut away, to find a pre-recorded clip, or to go to a station identification, but he couldn't bring himself to break the sanctity of the moment. He saw a tear roll down Johnny's cheek and splash onto the dark wood of the desk, and he knew that to interrupt this would be a betrayal of everything the show stood for. To look away now would be to admit that the network cared more for the clock than the human heart. It was a period of grace that defied the logic of the industry, a 2-minute eternity where the most famous man in the world was just a boy again. When Johnny finally began to lift his head, his face was raw and his eyes were rimmed with a deep, honest red that no amount of stage makeup could disguise. He looked at Artie, and for the first time in 30 years, the king of late night found that his legendary voice had completely deserted him. He reached out across the desk, not for a prop or a script, but for the hand of the man who had started it all, knowing that the words were finally over and the action was about to begin. The heavy silence was finally broken not by a joke or a burst of music, but by the audible creak of Johnny's chair as he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate like a man walking through a dream. He didn't look at the cameras or the teleprompter, and for the first time in his career, he turned his back completely on the millions of people watching at home to face the one person who truly saw him. In a gesture that would become one of the most whispered about moments in television history, Johnny Carson did something he had never done for any king, president, or Hollywood legend. He stepped back and bowed. It was a deep, respectful bow, the kind a student offers a master at the end of a long and difficult lesson. When he straightened up, Johnny walked around the mahogany desk and reached out both of his hands, taking Artie's weathered palms into his own. The audience watched in a state of hushed reverence as the most famous host in the world leaned down and whispered into the old man's ear, his voice thick with an emotion that no script could ever capture. He told Artie that the joke he had just shared was the only one that ever told the absolute truth about what it means to be a human being. He thanked him for the magic kit, for the encouragement in that dusty Nebraska basement, and for holding on to that index card. Artie looked up at Johnny, and for a fleeting second, The years seemed to fall away from his face, leaving behind the vibrant, young magician who had once believed he could change the world with a deck of cards. A soft, radiant light appeared in those tired blue eyes, a look of absolute peace that comes when a person finally realizes their life's work is complete. Johnny didn't let go of his hands, even as the stage manager signaled frantically that they were over their time. He remained there, anchored to the floor, providing the physical strength that Artie seemed to be losing by the minute. The band remained frozen in place, their instruments silent, as if any note played would be an intrusion upon a sacred conversation. The two men shared a private exchange that the microphones couldn't quite catch, a series of nods and small smiles that bridged the gap between 1944 and 1984. Johnny's face was a mask of pride and heartbreak, a complicated mixture of the boy who wanted to impress his teacher and the man who knew he was witnessing the final closing of a story. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own handkerchief, gently wiping a smudge of dust from Artie's lapel, treating that moth-eaten tuxedo with more care than if it were made of solid gold. It was a moment of pure, unscripted grace that reminded everyone watching that behind the fame and the fortune, we are all just looking for someone to tell us that our journey mattered. As the segment finally neared its end, Johnny leaned in one last time and pressed a kiss to the old man's forehead, a seal of love that transcended the bright lights and the artifice of Hollywood. He knew that the world would never be the same after this night, and he wanted to make sure Artie felt the warmth of the spotlight one last time. With a gentle tug, Johnny began to help Artie stand, but as the old man rose to his feet, a sudden change in the atmosphere suggested that the most emotional part of the evening was still waiting in the wings. The stage lights seemed to flicker for just a fraction of a second as Artie turned away from the desk, leaving behind nothing but the yellowed envelope and a legacy that had finally been realized. He walked with a newfound lightness, his steps no longer burdened by the 40-year secret he had carried across the country, while Johnny stood by the curtains and watched him disappear into the shadows of the hallway. The studio went to a commercial break, but for the first time in the history of The Tonight Show, the host did not go to his dressing room to consult with producers. Instead, he sat on the edge of the stage, his legs dangling over the side, staring at the empty seat in the third row. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that they matter, no matter how many years have passed. What the public did not see was the frantic activity behind the scenes as Johnny's personal assistant rushed to find a car for the elderly guest. Artie had refused any payment or any grand gesture of charity, insisting that his only goal was to deliver his message and return to the quiet life he had built. He climbed into the back of a waiting taxi, his hand resting on the window as he looked back at the studio one last time with a look of utter contentment. The driver later said that the old man seemed to be glowing from within, humming a soft tune from an old vaudeville act, finally at peace with a world that had tried so hard to forget him. Later that night, long after the audience had gone home and the janitors were sweeping up the discarded scripts and popcorn, a phone call came through to Johnny's private line. The news was delivered in hushed, respectful tones by a hospital chaplain who had been called to the scene where a taxi had pulled over on a quiet side street. Artie had reached the end of his time, just as the car was crossing the city limits, slipping away peacefully in the back seat with a smile still etched onto his weary face. He had simply finished his final act and taken his bow before the great transition. When Johnny arrived at the small apartment where Artie had lived for the last 20 years, he found a space that was almost entirely empty, save for a stack of old Tonight Show transcripts and a single photograph of Clara. On the small wooden table sat a second envelope, addressed simply to the boy from Nebraska. Inside was the index card Artie had shown him on stage, but now there was a postscript added in a shaky, final hand. It read, "I can go now, Johnny, because I saw the look in your eyes and I knew you remembered the magic. You were always my best trick, and seeing you shine was all the reward I ever needed." Johnny stood in that cold, lonely room and realized that Artie had spent his entire life in the shadows just so he could be the wind beneath Johnny's wings. He clutched the card to his chest, the tears falling freely now that there were no cameras to capture them, mourning the man who had loved him from afar without ever asking for a single thing in return. As he walked out of that apartment, Johnny knew that he couldn't keep this story to himself, for the envelope left on the desk held a final revelation that would change the way he viewed his fame forever. For 20 years, a single drawer in Johnny's mahogany desk remained locked to the world, holding a secret that the king of late night guarded more fiercely than his own reputation. It was only after Johnny himself had departed from this earth in 2005 that the mystery of that October night was finally unraveled, revealing a legacy of kindness that had been operating in the shadows for over 2 decades. When his executors opened the small, yellowed envelope that Artie had left on the desk, they didn't find a demand for money or a plea for fame, but a list of names of elderly performers, forgotten stagehands, and struggling artists who had spent their lives making others smile only to find themselves alone in their twilight years. Johnny had taken that list and transformed it into a silent mission of mercy that defined the second half of his life. Without ever alerting the press or seeking a single headline, he spent many late nights in his darkened office, personally signing checks for people he had never met, all because of the man in the threadbare tuxedo. He had spent millions of dollars ensuring that every person on that list, and hundreds more like them, were cared for until their very last moments. He paid for hospital stays, covered the rent for tiny apartments in New York and Los Angeles, and made sure that no one who had once contributed to the magic of the stage ever felt forgotten. It was his way of honoring Artie, of proving that the boy from Nebraska had not just learned how to perform a trick, but had learned the true meaning of the man who taught it to him. The legendary silence that had gripped the studio for those 2 minutes in 1984 wasn't just a pause in a television show. It was the moment Johnny Carson stopped being a celebrity and started being a son again. He never allowed NBC to air the footage of Artie's appearance in reruns, not because he was ashamed of his tears, but because he felt that some moments are too sacred to be packaged as entertainment for the masses. He kept that index card in his wallet until the day he passed beyond our sight, a constant reminder that the greatest audience we will ever play for is the person who believed in us when we had nothing. Artie had taught him that the real punchline of life is that we only keep what we give away. In the final episode of The Tonight Show in 1992, as the lights were dimming on a 30-year career, Johnny looked out at the audience one last time and touched his fingers to his lips, then to the third row of the theater. Most people thought it was just a general goodbye to the fans, but those who knew the story of the old man in the threadbare tuxedo knew better. He was saying thank you to a ghost, acknowledging the man who had given him the gift of silence so that he could finally hear the music of his own heart. The story of the joke that silenced a nation reminds us that our value is not measured by how many people know our names, but by how many people feel less alone because we existed. If Artie's story reminded you that the greatest legacy we leave behind is the kindness we show to others, please give this video a like. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden, heartwarming secrets of the legends you grew up with, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We have many more journeys into the past to share with you, right here. Thank you for watching, and remember your story matters more than you'll ever know.